Dumm die dumm, das Mikro funktioniert. Just recently, Ramsey Paul had Cultured Thug on his channel for an interview. A guy who openly calls himself a fascist, or sometimes a third positionist, which includes fascism. Reading through the comments, I got the impression people either didn't like Cultured Thug or had no idea what he was talking about. It seems to me the question what is fascism is just as confusing for the audience as the question what is white. And this inspired me to have an opinion myself. I will try to define the term in an easier and hopefully more meaningful way than usual. Before I can try to give a definition, I have to get two things out of the way. Number one, forget what they told you. I remember vividly all the definitions they brought to my attention during my education. Sure, this was quite a while ago, but something tells me it didn't got better since then. All definitions I came across came from so-called left-wing intellectuals. Since there is not a single molecule of truth in left-wing ideology, I feel bold enough to say there is no such thing as a left-wing intellectual. The absence of truth is something an intellectual would recognize. So if you're a left-winger and smart or educated, you are an ideologue, but clearly not an intellectual. At last you need a lot of dishonesty to constantly hide all your fallacies and flaws. Dishonesty is again a characteristic of ideologues, not a characteristic of intellectuals. All the definitions I have seen came with an agenda. The goal was always to make sure Hitler can never be seen as someone with a social attitude, and left-wingers can never become fascists. The left wants you to believe they alone care for others, and violence or force are exclusively methods of the right. As we all know, nothing could be further from the truth. So my advice is, purge all the definitions you have seen. They are most likely coming from the left and offer nothing but intellectual dishonesty. Number 2 of the prologue. There is no universal definition. The second thing I should mention is the absence of a universal definition. As far as I know, you can have your own opinion about fascism, and nobody has the authority to tell you this is wrong. At the end of the day, it is whatever you think it is. And this means everything I'm going to say today is nothing but my opinion, and if you can come up with something better, you're welcome. Okay, now I have one prerequisite. With this out of the way, I can approach fascism itself. My first suggestion is to change the concept. Most people conceptualize fascism as an ideology, and I would suggest to conceptualize fascism rather as a tool than an ideology. If you see it as a tool which can be implemented by various ideologies, this has quite some benefits. Things become smooth out of a sudden. Now it is possible to talk about left-wing fascism or Islamic fascism or Jewish fascism, even though I would prefer to call it Islamic supremacy and Jewish supremacy, because I think the supremacy aspect is more of a defining attribute in this case. Of course, this makes it necessary to find a specific term for our fascism, something like European right-wing fascism, to distinguish between various implementations of fascism. I would like to use 3 fragments of definition. Number 1. The origins. To my knowledge, the term fasci originates in ancient Rome. As far as I understand it, the fasci were a sort of police force, a man with a stick who can call you to order or punish you with his stick if necessary. Also, the fasci could team up and combine their sticks. Combined, we get something heavier, something heavy enough to beat you to death with it. This is where the symbolism and the name comes from. Fascism as a symbol of power. From this I derive my first fragment of definition. Fascism is the power which seeks to impose order onto an otherwise chaotic society. This is really not an exotic concept if you think about it. Every policeman, judge or correction facility is born out of the same idea and is not seen as any kind of abomination, not even in the most liberal society. Also, it is quite obvious for everybody with a brain, a society cannot function without an order and without the will to impose it, if necessary. Next step, the thinkers behind it. The authors, writers, thinkers and philosophers who became known as the fascists originate in Central Europe throughout the 1700s and the 1800s, predominantly in France and Austria. As far as I understand it, they were reactionaries in the first place. Fascism was their reaction to progressive revolutions in their environment. Keep in mind, progressivism meant something very different back then. Today, progressive refers to delusional postmodernists. Back then, it meant liberalism. The liberal events in their environment were the English Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and America. In their eyes, liberalism is a childish idea and cannot lead to anything else than destruction. I guess we are all by now painfully aware how right they had it back then. I would derive my second fragment of definition from this and say, fascism is anti-liberal. With fragment number 3, I refer to the great inventions. So, what is so significant about the 1700s and the 1800s? There are certainly a lot of things one could mention, but one intellectual invention stands out: the definition of the scientific method and all the implications coming from it. For example, the Industrial Revolution. This couldn't have happened without science, and few things had an impact on the world like this. The scientific method is in my eyes in the same league as fire, book printing, needle and thread, agriculture. The scientific method is really big and was certainly very prevalent in the thoughts of intellectuals of the time. That's how I got the impression the third fragment of definition should be: European right-wing fascism is deeply rooted in science. Of course, this has a lot of implications and is the reason for all the trouble about it. The main sciences are physics, chemistry and biology, and the engineering derived from them. What is called the STEM fields today. One nice implication is environmentalism. As far as I know, the fascists came up with this. To see the human as a biological creature embedded in a biological environment, and to conclude what is good for the environment will be good for humans too, is a very obvious line of thought. But the very same biological worldview will inevitably lead to race and IQ, and we all know what the implications of this are. We couldn't go as far to say fascism will always be a race-based system, but fascist ideas are certainly prone to include racial awareness and incorporate group differences into the body of thought. As a personal note, I'm fine with this. Racial awareness is in my eyes a perfectly healthy and normal human condition. From the supremacist view of this certain tribe from the Middle East, fascism is such a problem precisely because it is rooted in science. If science is properly applied, their lies and pseudo-moral will quickly be seen as what they really are: fraudulent fantasies. Also, a political system which is based in science would have the tools to correct itself and finally work as intended, and thereby protect our interests against their malicious ambitions. It is no coincidence fascism was the greatest threat ever to their ambitions, and they did absolutely everything to get rid of it, and it is still to this day the one political philosophy they hate more than everything else. So this is what I think what fascism is. It is rather a tool than an ideology. It can be implemented by various ideologies. The European fascism is a symbol of power and seeks to impose order onto a society. It is staunchly anti-liberal, which is seen as a childish and hopeless attempt to trick nature, And finally, it is rooted in science, means it tries to stick with reality rather than fantasy or moral. Good. So much for my attempt to define fascism. I feel compelled to continue with 2 add-ons and say something about moral and spirituality in relation to fascism.